Welcome to today's edition of the Human School Mindshift Cards podcast, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. I'm Chad.
Rachel.
And I'm Randy.
Each week, we model brief inquiry conversations around one of the Mindshift cards in the Human School Mindshift Cards pack. If you want to explore further questions, card sets are available at thehuman.school. In this episode, our question comes from the Objector Compass Point, and the question is, how do you define compliance? What does it look like, sound like, or feel like to be passively compliant? So I'll start. The way that I define compliance is basically it's falling in line and doing, what is required of you. And oftentimes, I think the key here is that compliance is driven by someone above you, positionally or hierarchically, but also it's the things that you just kind of have to do. And when I think about what it feels like or it sounds like to be passively compliant, it's when you're doing something, and I kind of use the phrase soul sucking. It feels completely maybe like you're doing something just to check a box. It doesn't invigorate you or bring you vitality. So that would be my definition of compliance. I'm interested. Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I think when I think about compliance, I think of it as like box checking. It's the logistics piece, the things that you either feel like you're supposed to do or that someone has told you that you need to do. But in terms of the look like, sound like, and feel like piece of it, it's so interesting to me. I think that compliance always has a negative connotation. And I don't think that it has to. I think that there are things that we do that don't make us feel like it's soul sucking. It is just a box check. And I also think our perspective often can impact that as well. But it is interesting. I think that it always has such a negative context. And I'm wondering if it's negative for Randy too.
Generally it is. And I think back to the various roles that I've had over the course of my career, and the least exciting days were the days when we had to focus on compliance things. And those are, what does it look like? It looks like other people requiring you to do things. You're required to meet their requirements, their wishes. And so I'm losing agency, and it feels like exactly what I was thinking, exactly what Chad said, soul sucking. And it sort of takes, for me personally, it sort of takes the energy and the vigor out of the work when I have to move away from what I would like to do to what I have to do for somebody else. And that generally doesn't feel very good. And I'm trying to think of, in terms of Rachel's content, are there times when compliance feels okay to me?
I'm
not sure. I have to think about that. Go ahead, Chad.
Well, I would say that, there are parts of people's personalities, myself included, who has that checklist of things that help you feel accomplished. And sometimes the compliance things are like really easy, relatively speaking. They're not so messy. They're typically clear and you just can do them. And like at the beginning of the day, if I have a list of 9 things, I'm going to guess 8 of them are probably in some capacity compliance driven. It's, did I fill out this paperwork? Did I send this response? Did I do? And so I think that compliance, I think your point, Randy, about compliance being for somebody else, perhaps if the compliance is in support of somebody else or helpful in nature, that could feel good, right? So if I have to do something, but it helps somebody else move forward, that would be an example of where it might not feel so bad. I think my immediate thoughts about compliance are, government mandates, or again, a boss who doesn't, delegate something that maybe you don't have a lot of skill for, or you do, but it's not something you enjoy. And I'm maybe bringing that overly negative lens to it. But I would say there's places where compliance could feel good, but in this sense, I genuinely think it's negative because it does rob us of our agency.
Okay, I'm making a connection now. I think compliance is good when it takes me out of my individual world and makes me feel like I'm part of a collective, and that what I'm doing is contributing to the forward movement or the betterment of the collective. I think that that would be a time where I think compliance would be a good
Yeah, I
thing.
was trying to think of it.
And
Go ahead.
maybe I'll go into a controversial area, but the idea of like getting a vaccine, like there are certain places where in order to eat in a restaurant or go to the theater, you have to be compliant. I'm okay being compliant with a vaccine because personally I'm okay with that. But I could understand how maybe there are some people that are not in favor of vaccinations, that they might feel like that's a bit of, the compliance, like I was feeling like I was doing something for somebody else.
I was
ahead,
thinking
Rachel.
of it too, and sort of like twofold. So the first thing that I was thinking of was like the compliance officer that I know exists in some business worlds. Like I have a couple of friends who work in the medical research world, and so FDA compliance and that sort of thing. The other thing though that I was thinking about was like home life, and I don't usually use the word compliance around things like in my personal life. It's usually only work related, but if I think about it that way, things like doing the dishes and vacuuming, that those are things that we do because we're supposed to, but also it's a betterment of our household or for our families or, anything like that. But the other thing that I think about too, and kind of going back to what I said before about perspective, is how I might use that compliance, passively compliant moment in order to do something for myself, right? So like for me, washing dishes is really meditative because I'm just focusing on, or cooking, like is me in my head just sort of going through this automatic motion that I don't have to think too hard about, and that it allows some space for my mind to wander, or for me to just engage in the actions and disconnect my mind even. And so I think some of that compliance, passively compliant, does often feel really negative. But I think that there are places where we can make conscious choices to do things a little bit differently, or use that time, or disconnect. Sometimes that can be helpful. Or I like what both of you said about it being in service of others. Depending on your personality, that might make it feel a little bit better. But I can't ever help but wonder when we talk about things that are compliance driven, they never feel good.
So it's interesting. Randy poked a bear maybe in a controversial, and I'll use one in the school setting, which is, something like a pacing guide, and whether or not that is real compliance or perceived compliance. Right. And so, oftentimes I was a curriculum supervisor, and, you sit and you create a pacing guide as a way to help support teachers to, understand, in general, there's a certain amount of time and space if we have, standards and curriculum and things like that. And then oftentimes, teachers, rightfully so, will say, well, I've got to stick to the pacing guide. And that doesn't feel human centered. And so there's a place or a structure that we have in schools where it may be well intentioned to provide a supportive guardrail, but yet people get stuck on the compliance piece of it, as opposed to what the intention of it, which is to really just provide some guidance and support. And so I think, one of the things that we always say is good questions lead to other questions. I think it's, what are the mechanisms in schools that are purely compliance? But then I think a secondary question is how might we as educators get stuck with the compliant mindset, right? So are we perceiving that having to be compliance, or is it a real compliance issue? Again, very messy. I'm wondering if you guys have questions.
I guess I'll go. So we couple the words passively and compliant. And Rachel's question about, like, could compliance be okay, like a positive side to compliance, makes me think like, ooh, we could explore that. Like, are there other kinds of compliance and other words that we might use other than passively? I think we chose passively because we were wanting to try and contrast it to actively curious. So passive and active. But so the question is, are there other descriptors for compliance that we might consider beyond passive? And I think that's an important question too, because one of the things that we're really focused on here is this is an iterative project that we're working on, and we're throwing these ideas out, but we're going to shape them through these kinds of conversations, but also by engaging other people in the community. And so I am really curious whether passive is the right word, or what other choices might we have?
I mean, I immediately thought of like necessary compliance, right? In a way, in a context where like you just have to do it. Like there's parts of our jobs that you just have to do. I know that's taking us in a different direction, but like I think a clear definition for me or a distinction, would be around, there's just some things like, I have to fill out the paperwork that's required so that people get paid in the way that they need to in my job. That's a necessary compliance thing that I don't get upset about. I can be frustrated at how long it takes or the process not being efficient, but I recognize it's not really a choice. I think a distinction for me is, an example, do I have to follow a district created curriculum? Is by following a district created curriculum me being passively compliant, or is it a necessary compliance? That's where I think that there's some interesting and conversations in the middle of that. Go ahead, Rachel.
I'm thinking about the point that Randy made about us putting compliance and curiosity at odds, and whether being one means that you aren't also the other simultaneously. Like that, are they really at odds? If I'm being compliant, does it mean that I can't be curious about that compliance? Or if I'm being curious, does that mean that I can't be also compliant in that curiosity? So I'm thinking about whether or not those two really are at odds, kind of the way that we framed them.
Yeah, future conversation.
So, as we mentioned earlier, all good inquiries lead to more curiosity. And we hope that as your mind begins to shift, you will share your thoughts and ideas and questions with us in the Human School community. We wanted to thank you so much for learning alongside us for this edition of the Human School's Mindshift Cards podcast. The Human School. By placing humanity at the center of all design, the Human School seeks to share an evolving story of learning and its impact on the world. Visit thehuman.school and its Learning and Public Hub for additional resources and to join our community committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. You can also follow us on various social media platforms, and we cannot wait to hear how you are intentionally placing humanity at the center.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.